a black soldier, fresh off deployment and filled with hope to finally return home, stepped into the airport, and in that moment, everything changed. Without warning, a racist cop singled him out, subjecting him to public humiliation in front of startled onlookers. And then, just 7 minutes later, he was fired on the spot. What followed shocked everyone and triggered a chain reaction of events that no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story as impactful as I do, don't forget to subscribe for more. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary day. In the pale light of an early autumn morning, Captain Marcus Ellis stepped onto the cold, unyielding tarmac of Hawthorne Air Base, a place where the hum of engines and the distant roar of fighter jets set the pulse of a nation that has long wrestled with both promise and prejudice. As he walked toward the hangar, each step resonated with the weight of his history, a history forged in the crucible of discrimination and refined by years of relentless determination. For many of us who have witnessed the slow, steady march of change, and the stubborn persistence of old wounds, this moment was both a return to duty and a reawakening of memory. The air was crisp, carrying with it the muted echoes of voices from a past that refused to be forgotten. In every glance exchanged among the base's inhabitants, in every whispered remark that slipped past the veneer of protocol, there lay an undercurrent of bias. It was a bias so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that even the calm morning routine of a military installation could not escape its subtle tyranny. As Marcus made his way along the familiar path, he could almost feel the silent scrutiny of those who had not yet learned to see beyond the color of his skin. A reminder that, despite his accolades and the skill that had carried him through countless missions, there remained a persistent skepticism about his place among them. Yet, within that scrutiny, there was a quiet defiance. For in the cockpit, high above the terrestrial judgments that sought to pin him down, Marcus discovered a realm where only the truth of his talent and the purity of his focus mattered. Today, however, the airbase was not merely a backdrop for routine drills. It was a stage upon which the contradictions of American life would play out in sharp relief. The steady cadence of preparation gave way to the rising tempo of challenges, each one a test not only of technical skill but of the human spirit. As he approached his jet, a sleek F-22 Raptor that gleamed with the promise of freedom, Marcus recalled a lifetime of battles fought on far different front lines. There were days when a dismissive sneer or a cutting remark had threatened to undermine his resolve. Now, in the quiet majesty of that pre-dawn light, every moment pulsed with the anticipation of another challenge, a reminder that the journey toward genuine equality was paved with both triumphs and trials. For the men and women gathered around him, many of whom had witnessed eras when segregation was not just policy but an everyday reality, the scene was a poignant echo of the past. They remembered a time when a black man's presence in spaces reserved for the best was questioned with barely concealed disdain. Now, as they prepared for the day's exercises, the air was heavy with a mixture of pride and sorrow, a legacy of victories hard won and battles yet to be resolved. In that charged atmosphere, Marcus paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the horizon where the first rays of sunlight began to break through the darkness. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions. How much progress had been made when even here, among disciplined ranks, the ghost of bias still lingered? How could a man who had dedicated his life to serving a country that promised freedom also bear the constant burden of proving his worth against the preconceptions of those who had not shared his struggle? These thoughts, like the slow build of a symphony, set the tone for the day ahead. The base was a microcosm of a larger America, one that, despite its lofty declarations of equality and liberty, was still haunted by contradictions. In everyday interactions, in the casual comments that slipped through the rigorous training routines, the legacy of discrimination was a constant companion. And yet, there was hope in the resilience of those who refused to be defined by the narrow expectations of others. Captain Marcus Ellis carried that hope within him as he climbed into the cockpit. In the intimate confines of the fighter jet, far above the murmurs of everyday prejudice, he prepared to reclaim a truth that transcended the limits imposed by society. Here, in the pure, unadulterated expanse of the sky, There was only the steady beat of his heart, the hum of the engines, and the enduring promise that his skill and determination would always speak louder than the echoes of a biased past. And so began another day. A day marked by the subtle yet relentless challenges of a world still learning to reconcile its ideals with its realities. For those of us who have lived long enough to see the promises of yesterday and the struggles of today, this is not merely a routine exercise at an airbase. It is a testament to the unyielding spirit of a man who dares to soar above the constraints of a history that insists on lingering in the shadows. A beacon for a future where the measure of a person is determined not by the color of their skin but by the depth of their courage and the clarity of their vision. As the first rays of a reluctant sun crept over the horizon, the air at Hawthorne Air Base grew thick with a tension that was as palpable as it was unspoken. In the orderly bustle of the early morning, beneath the precise cadence of military drills, subtle currents of prejudice began to stir. Whispers that echoed the old wounds of a nation still grappling with the remnants of its segregated past. Captain Marcus Ellis moved through the corridors of the base with the quiet assurance of a man who had, for years, defied expectations. Yet even as he passed the gleaming facades and meticulously maintained barracks, there was an undercurrent of doubt, a furtive glance or a half-muted remark that belied the respect his skill had earned. In these moments, the contradictions of everyday life in America revealed themselves. The very institutions that prided themselves on discipline and order were not immune to the corrosive influence of bias. A bias that lurked in the tone of a hushed conversation, in the way a name was mispronounced, as if to diminish the weight of his accomplishments. In the briefing room, where the plans for the day's exercises were laid out with military precision, Marcus could feel the slow, measured heartbeat of skepticism from some corners of the room. A few eyes, weathered by decades of witnessing change yet still tethered to outdated notions, flickered with a subtle disapproval that spoke louder than any overt insult. They recalled a time when a black man's presence was seen not as a testament to progress but as a quiet defiance of the natural order. And though the language of the day had changed, the echoes of that painful history still resonated in every measured word and every sidelong glance. The challenges, both overt and hidden, began to build as the day advanced. During a routine inspection, a senior officer, a man whose voice had once commanded absolute authority, allowed a comment to slip through, masked as concern yet dripping with condescension. "Captain Ellis, you must understand that in our line of work, precision is everything. One must be sure that every decision is as impeccable as the standard expected of us." His words, though wrapped in the guise of mentorship, carried a bitter subtext that suggested Marcus's very presence was an anomaly, a deviation from what was considered the norm. In that instant, the room's air seemed to vibrate with the weight of unspoken assumptions, each syllable a reminder that progress, no matter how steadfast, was still marred by the persistence of old prejudices. Outside, as the base stirred to life with the sound of engines and the clamor of preparation, Marcus found himself caught in a quiet storm of introspection. His mind wandered to a lifetime of silent battles, days when the world outside had seen him not for the brilliance of his skill or the honor of his service, but for the color of his skin. Each memory was a small flame, each moment of dismissal a spark that, when combined, formed a rising tide of doubt. And yet, within that tide lay the raw, unfiltered essence of his determination. For every whispered slight, for every half-uttered comment cloaked in civility yet laced with bias, there was an unyielding defiance that had carried him through countless storms before. In that moment, the base itself became a microcosm of America's fractured soul, a place where the promise of modernity clashed with the lingering shadows of a segregated past. The very air seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a nation in transition, where every routine task was tinged with the bittersweet taste of progress hard-earned and still incomplete. For those of us who have witnessed the relentless march of time, from the days when the simplest act of dignity was a revolutionary statement to now, when such acts are both celebrated and expected, the challenges of the day were more than mere tasks. They were a silent, relentless reminder of the work that remained, to transform the quiet, pervasive prejudices into a future where the measure of a man was not determined by the hue of his skin, but by the depth of his courage and the integrity of his character. As the morning deepened into the full light of day, the rising tide of doubt and defiance swelled within Marcus Ellis. It was a tide that, despite its turbulent force, carried with it the seeds of change. For in every challenge, every subtle slight and every masked remark, there lay an opportunity, a chance to rise above the petty echoes of discrimination. To let the clear, unwavering voice of truth and ability be heard. And so, with the steady beat of his heart and the silent strength of a man who had long walked this arduous path, Captain Ellis prepared to meet the day's mounting challenges, determined to transform each obstacle into a stepping stone toward a more just and compassionate horizon. As the base shifted from the cautious stirrings of morning to the vibrant pulse of a working day, Captain Marcus Ellis found himself once more immersed in the quiet, persistent clash of hope and history. The corridors of Hawthorne Air Base, usually a realm of order and precision, now resonated with the soft but insistent echoes of a time-worn injustice. A legacy that whispered through every gesture, every curt nod, every half-spoken word, in the midst of routine inspections and the steady murmur of pre-flight preparations. Subtle reminders of a segregated past emerged. A junior officer's dismissive tone during a casual greeting, the condescending pause before a seemingly benign comment about extra diligence, and the lingering sideways glances that spoke of doubts unspoken. All of these were small yet searing annotations in the daily ledger of discrimination. Each interaction, though fleeting, carried with it the weight of centuries, a quiet, relentless insistence that a black man in a position of honor was still an anomaly in a system reluctant to let go of its old prejudices. Marcus moved through these challenges with a measured resolve forged in the crucible of countless battles. Both in the skies and on the ground. In the sterile light of the briefing room. While plans for the day's exercises were meticulously laid out, his mind wandered to memories of a bygone era when every affirmation of his worth was hard-won. Now, even as his reputation as a skilled pilot shone brightly, the remnants of those earlier days, when his very presence was questioned, lurked in the subtle nuances of everyday conversation. The subtle crescendo of microaggressions built steadily as the day unfolded, each slight a quiet challenge to the dignity he had long fought to preserve. Yet, in the midst of these accumulating indignities, there was an undeniable, resilient defiance in Marcus's eyes. A fierce promise that the measure of a man was not to be defined by the biases of others, but by the strength of his character and the clarity of his purpose. For those of us who have witnessed the slow, often painful evolution of our nation, from overt segregation to the covert echoes of discrimination in modern life, this chapter of Marcus's day was both a reminder of the past and a call to the future. It was a moment when every whispered doubt and every half-hidden insult became a stepping stone, urging him to rise above the confines of a history that still sought to tether him. In that charged space between routine duty and the unyielding burden of legacy, Captain Ellis prepared to once again take flight, not merely as a pilot, but as a living testament to the enduring power of resilience. As he stepped toward his jet, the promise of the open sky beckoned, a realm where the purity of skill and the quiet dignity of the human spirit could transcend the narrow limits of prejudice. And so, with each determined step, he carried the weight of his past, transforming every challenge into an affirmation that, in the grand tapestry of life, true worth is measured not by the color of one's skin, but by the depth of one's courage and the strength of one's soul. By mid-afternoon, the base's orderly rhythm began to warp under the weight of unspoken truths. In the stillness between scheduled drills and routine briefings, the quiet indignities of daily life surged like a gathering storm. Captain Marcus Ellis, through composed and resolute, could no longer ignore the persistent echoes of a past that refused to fade. It was as if every polished surface, every measured step on the tarmac, carried with it the faint but relentless whisper of a time when a man's worth was measured by the color of his skin. In a rarely visited corner of the mess hall, a space where weary voices of seasoned airmen mingled with hopeful murmurs of youth, a conversation erupted. An older officer, his voice heavy with decades of experiences both bitter and triumphant, recounted memories of a bygone era when discrimination was a blatant, open insult. His words, though hushed, carried a piercing clarity. There was a time when a black man standing tall among us was seen as an anomaly. a disruption to the order we clung to. The truth in his admission reverberated through the room, stirring up emotions that had long lain dormant beneath the veneer of routine. Marcus listened intently, each syllable a reminder that even within the disciplined confines of military life, prejudice had a way of seeping into the everyday. At that moment, the silent agreement to accept minor slights as part of the status quo began to crumble. The air grew heavy with the unspoken recognition that progress, however measured, had not yet vanquished the ghosts of segregation. Every remark, every sidelong glance from a colleague who had not yet unlearned the old ways, was a quiet testament to a society still ensnared in its contradictions. It was then that a younger officer, emboldened perhaps by years of witnessing both injustice and resilience, spoke up, his voice, raw with the fervor of unspent passion, cut through the murmurs. We are not defined by the shadows of yesterday. Every time we endure these quiet torments, we are reminded not only of our struggle but also of our strength. The room fell silent as his words sank in, a fragile bridge forming between the hardened cynicism of the past and the unyielding hope of a future built on mutual respect. For Marcus, that moment was a turning point, a breaking of silence that resonated far beyond the walls of the mess hall. Here, in this microcosm of American life, the contradictions of daily existence were laid bare. The subtle jabs and covert dismissals that had punctuated his everyday were no longer just nuisances to be endured. They were challenges that demanded a response. They were the quiet rebellions of a man who had flown through storms both literal and metaphorical, whose every maneuver in the cockpit had been a defiant claim to his right to exist fully and fiercely in a world that too often sought to diminish him. In the gathering dusk, as the base settled into an uneasy calm, the breaking of that long-held silence was not marked by a single dramatic confrontation but by a series of small, resolute acts, each one a testament to the belief that the measure of a man lies not in the prejudices imposed upon him, but in the courage with which he meets them. And so, Captain Marcus Ellis prepared to face the coming hours with a quiet determination, aware that in the struggle against the subtle tyranny of everyday racism, every word spoken, every truth shared, was a step toward a future where the value of a human being was recognized not by the color of his skin, but by the depth of his spirit. By mid-afternoon, as the base's routine settled into the languid hum of duty, the quiet storm of everyday prejudice gathered with a force that could no longer be ignored. In the shadow of well-worn corridors and beneath the crisp order of military precision, subtle jabs and half-spoken assumptions began to crystallize into a moment of raw, undeniable challenge. In the modest refuge of the mess hall, a space where veterans and newcomers alike gathered to share brief reprieves from the relentless pace of drills, Captain Marcus Ellis found himself at the center of an exchange that would mark a turning point in his day. Over cups of bitter coffee, an aging officer, whose eyes still bore the marks of a segregated past, let slip a remark that cut deeper than any physical blow. You've come a long way, Captain, but remember, in our line of work, tradition isn't something we change overnight. The words, wrapped in the veneer of nostalgia and cautious advice, carried an undercurrent of disbelief that a man like Marcus, with his flawless record and unparalleled skill, could ever truly belong among them. In that moment, the subtle cruelty of everyday racism, once dismissed as mere background noise, resounded with a stark clarity. It was a quiet accusation, an insistence that his very presence was a disruption to the established order, a reminder that progress and prejudice were inextricably entwined. For Marcus, the comment was more than an isolated slight. It was a microcosm of a lifetime spent navigating a labyrinth of expectations and denials. His heart, hardened by years of silent endurance, throbbed with a measured defiance. With a voice that blended sorrow with unyielding resolve, he responded, not in anger, but in a tone that carried the weight of countless untold stories. Tradition, indeed, is stubborn, yet, it is only through the courage to redefine it that we honor both the past and the promise of tomorrow. In that measured retort, the crucible of confrontation transformed into a crucible of resilience. His words, simple yet profound, reverberated around the table, drawing a silence that was at once reflective and transformative. For those of us who have witnessed America's slow and painful evolution, From overt segregation to the furtive echoes of bias that linger in our daily lives. This exchange was a reminder that every act of quiet defiance contributes to the slow, steady dismantling of a legacy built on exclusion. Outside the mess hall, as the base continued its orchestrated symphony of drills and preparations, Marcus carried that moment with him. A spark of truth in a landscape still marred by contradictions. Each subtle affront, each carefully veiled remark, now added fuel to the inner fire that had sustained him through countless trials. The challenges were increasing, as they always had, in a manner that was as insidious as it was constant. And yet, in the face of these daily tests, his resolve only deepened. For those who have spent a lifetime watching the slow unraveling of an America that promised equality yet clung to the vestiges of its divided past, the day's confrontation was not merely an incident. It was an emblem of the enduring struggle for dignity. In the crucible of such moments, where the echoes of injustice meet the strength of a resolute spirit, true character is forged. And so, as the afternoon light waned into a contemplative dusk, Captain Marcus Ellis prepared to meet the next challenge, not as a man burdened by prejudice, but as a beacon of the relentless courage that lies at the heart of every quiet battle for equality. As the day crept toward evening and the light softened into a muted glow over Hawthorne Air Base, Captain Marcus Ellis felt the mounting weight of countless unseen burdens. Every step he took along the polished corridors and every measured glance cast his way reminded him that, beneath the veneer of progress, the ghosts of discrimination still lingered. In these quieter moments, when the clamor of drills gave way to reflective silence, the subtle contradictions of everyday racism became impossible to ignore. They were etched into the very fabric of his existence. The way a nod turned into a questioning tilt of the head. The half-smile that betrayed discomfort. The lingering pause before a handshake that once promised camaraderie. In the midst of this twilight, as the base began to exhale the heat of the day, the echoes of the past converged with the disquiet of the present. It was here, in the stillness of a nearly empty briefing room, that the memories of old battles, those fought on segregated streets and in hallowed halls of injustice, resurfaced with a quiet urgency. The weight of invisibility, so meticulously imposed by a society unwilling to fully shed its prejudiced legacy, pressed against Marcus's chest like an unyielding force. Every unspoken slight and every casual dismissal, seemingly trivial in isolation, accumulated into a towering monument to the injustices that had defined far too many lives. Yet, in that heavy silence, there was also a defiant spark, a reminder that the struggle against the insidious tide of bias was not merely a burden, but a call to reclaim dignity. For those who have borne witness to America's long, painful evolution, from the blatant cruelties of segregation to the covert indignities of modern prejudice, the toll of invisibility is both a wound and a rallying cry. Marcus, with the resolute calm of one who has flown through storms both literal and metaphorical, understood that the quiet suffering of the day was not a concession to fate but a challenge to be met head-on. And so, as the base settled into the hushed rhythms of evening, Captain Ellis carried with him the bittersweet knowledge that each moment of hardship was forging a strength that could neither be diminished nor denied. In that gathering dusk, where the soft light of memory intertwined with the promise of tomorrow, he resolved to let his very presence, his skill, his resilience, and the unspoken truths of his life, speak louder than the shadows of a past that still sought to render him invisible. For in the silent toll of these everyday battles, there lay the fierce, unyielding cost of forging a new destiny, one measured not by the color of one's skin but by the depth of one's courage and the purity of one's truth. As dusk settled over Hawthorne Air Base, the day's accumulated tensions refused to be hidden beneath the routine of military life. In the soft twilight, where the harsh glare of daylight began to merge with the contemplative shadows of memory, Captain Marcus Ellis encountered a moment that would unmask the insidious layers of prejudice. Layers that had long been cloaked in silence and subtlety. It began with a seemingly trivial exchange in the corridor. A casual comment from an officer, delivered with a smile that failed to reach his eyes. It must be strange, Captain, always having to prove your mettle twice over. The words, wrapped in a veneer of camaraderie, carried the weight of a historical contradiction that Marcus had borne all his life. For those of us who have witnessed the slow transformation of our nation, from the overt cruelties of segregation to the quiet, persistent echoes of bias, such remarks cut deeper than any overt insult. They reminded him that, despite the progress celebrated by society, the shadow of discrimination was never far behind. In that charged moment, the air grew thick with unspoken truths. The base, a microcosm of a country that claimed to have evolved beyond its past, now bore the subtle scars of yesterday. A constant reminder that respect and dignity were privileges still too often doled out in uneven measure. Marcus felt the sting not only of the remark itself, but of what it represented, a daily reckoning with a legacy that questioned the very essence of his worth. It was a contradiction too potent to ignore. A man, celebrated for his flawless skill and heroic leadership, reduced in a fleeting instant to a symbol of an enduring stereotype. Yet, as the comment echoed in his mind, a defiant calm began to rise within him. He recalled the countless days when his very existence had been a silent protest against a society that measured worth in shallow terms. In that reflection, Marcus found the resolve to transform the bitterness of the moment into a quiet declaration of truth. Yes, he thought, I have always had to work twice as hard to be seen. But my value is not determined by the narrow gaze of those who still cling to old prejudices. His inner voice, steady and resolute, was a beacon in the gathering gloom, a reminder that the measure of a man lies not in the whispers of bias, but in the courage to claim one's own dignity. In the corridor's fading light, as he continued on his path toward the jet, Marcus carried with him the weight of that encounter, a weight that was both a burden and a catalyst. It was a burden born from a lifetime of subtle denials and a catalyst for change, urging him to speak out through his actions, to let his unwavering focus and skill dismantle the lingering myth that his presence was an anomaly. For every slight that sought to diminish him, there was an equal and enduring force within him, a force built on years of perseverance, forged in the crucible of adversity, and destined to shine like a steadfast star against the encroaching night. As night fell and the base settled into the quiet hum of post-duty routine, the unmasking of prejudice in that brief encounter resonated deeply within him. It was a moment that encapsulated the painful contradiction of a nation still learning to reconcile its ideals with its reality. A reality where every day, in small yet profound ways, the legacy of discrimination continued to challenge the progress of those who dared to soar above it. And in that challenge, Captain Marcus Ellis found the strength to keep flying, to keep defying the narrow confines of a biased world, and to let his very existence be a testament to the enduring power of resilience and hope. As the night surrendered to the first tender blush of dawn, the soft light revealed the raw truths long concealed beneath the weight of routine and unspoken prejudice. At Hawthorne Air Base, where every polished step and every measured glance had once masked the quiet persistence of bias, this new morning exposed the deep fissures in the fabric of everyday life. A life still haunted by the ghosts of segregation and the lingering echo of a divided past. In the crisp early light, Captain Marcus Ellis emerged from the solitude of his quarters, each step resonating with the memories of countless silent battles fought in the corridors of power and in the hearts of those who had witnessed America's slow, painful evolution. The base, usually a realm of order and precision, now pulsed with an undercurrent of disquiet. Every casual nod, every brief pause before a greeting, every half-smile concealed layers of assumption that insisted his presence was still an anomaly in a system that had long struggled to let go of its old ways. It was in the mess hall, where the clamor of shared meals and the soft murmur of conversations served as the backdrop for unguarded moments, that Marcus encountered a confrontation that would shake him to his core. An officer, whose voice trembled between regret and defensiveness, hesitantly offered a remark that cut like a whispered reminder of a bygone era. "Captain, sometimes I wonder if your brilliance comes at a cost that you alone must bear." Those words, spoken in a tone that mingled pity with prejudice, were not merely an isolated slight. They were the cumulative weight of a lifetime of subtle, relentless devaluation. For those who have seen decades pass and witnessed the slow unfurling of change, such moments are painfully familiar. A reminder that progress, however celebrated, is still marred by the remnants of a deeply divided history. In that charged silence, Marcus drew upon the well of his resolve, his voice steady as he replied. The cost of brilliance, like the cost of truth, is not mine alone to bear. It is a burden shared by every soul who yearns for justice in a nation still learning to see beyond its scars. His words, measured and unyielding, hung in the air like a challenge, a call to acknowledge that true progress is forged in the crucible of collective struggle, not in the empty accolades of complacency. As the day advanced, the base transformed into a living testament to America's fractured soul, a microcosm where the old and the new, the wounded and the hopeful, coexisted in an uneasy balance. Every interaction became a silent battleground, where even the smallest act of recognition or the briefest gesture of solidarity offered a glimmer of possibility. Yet, beneath each hopeful moment lurked the persistent echo of discrimination, a reminder that the fight for dignity is not measured by the absence of bias, but by the courage to confront it head-on. In the unyielding glow of that dawning day, Captain Marcus Ellis stepped forward into the light with a determination born of years spent navigating a world that too often reduced a man to the color of his skin. For those who have witnessed the slow, arduous march toward equality, his journey was a powerful testament. The measure of a person is not defined by the prejudices imposed upon them but by the strength of their spirit and the depth of their compassion. And so, as the sun climbed higher and illuminated the fractures in the facade of progress, the promise of a new day beckoned, a day where every quiet act of defiance, every sincere word, and every unspoken truth would weave together the tapestry of a future defined not by division, but by a shared, unyielding humanity.